I thought I would find eternal peace, but on the other side, I only found questions. The piercing sound of twisting metal tore through the night air as the world around me spun in a chaotic whirlwind of lights and shadows. In an instant, I was driving down the isolated road, lost in thoughts of business and prayers. In the next, my car was dancing a deadly waltz with the asphalt, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The impact was sudden, violent, and deafening. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. As I lay there, trapped in the twisted entrails of what was once my vehicle, a strange calm enveloped me. It was as if time had slowed down, allowing me to absorb every detail of that crucial moment. The acrid smell of burnt rubber and engine fluids mingled with the metallic aroma of blood. My blood. The pain, curiously, was absent, replaced by a numbing sensation that spread from my chest to my extremities. Amidst the confusion and chaos, my thoughts turned to Allah. As a devout Muslim businessman, I had dedicated my life to following the teachings of the Quran, performing my daily prayers with fervor and conducting my business with Islamic integrity. At that moment, between life and death, I expected to feel the comforting presence of my Creator, the promise of mercy and salvation that had guided my existence. But what came was not what I expected. As my consciousness began to fade, I heard in the distance the unmistakable sound of an ambulance siren. It was a strangely comforting sound, a reminder that the world was still turning, that help was on the way. However, before I could cling to that hope, darkness enveloped me completely. In the void that followed, there was no light, no tunnel, no visions of heaven or hell, only a deafening silence and an impenetrable darkness. It was as if I had been thrown into a bottomless abyss, devoid of any sensation or stimulus. In that moment of absolute solitude, I felt a presence. It wasn't the loving and merciful presence of Allah that I had so hoped for, but something different, something indefinable. This presence offered neither comfort nor condemnation. It was neutral, observant, as if merely witnessing my passage through that intermediate state. I wanted to scream, I wanted to beg for mercy, I wanted to reaffirm my faith, but I had no voice, no body, nothing but my consciousness floating in that void. As I struggled to comprehend what was happening, scenes from my life began to unfold before me. I saw myself as a young businessman, determined to build an empire following Islamic principles. I observed moments of triumph in business, celebrations with family, acts of charity performed in the name of Allah. But I also saw moments of weakness, questionable decisions, opportunities to do good that were ignored. Each memory was vivid, more real than any recollection I had ever had. It was as if I was reliving each moment, feeling every emotion again, but now with a clarity and perspective I never had in life. I saw the impact of my actions not just on myself, but on everyone around me. Family, friends, employees, even strangers whose lives I had touched without realizing it. As these scenes unfolded, a question began to echo in the vastness of the void. Why? Why was I, a man who had dedicated his life to faith, experiencing this doubt at the most crucial moment? Why, instead of the divine light I had always imagined, was I enveloped in this neutral darkness? Why was the presence I felt not that of Allah, but something so indefinable? These questions reverberated through my being, shaking the foundations of my faith in a way I had never experienced before. All my life, I had found comfort and guidance in the certainty of my belief. Now, confronted with the unknown, that certainty was shattering. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the experience ended. The darkness began to dissipate, giving way to a blur of confused lights and sounds. Slowly, painfully, I returned to consciousness. I opened my eyes to find myself in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, monitoring every beat of my newly saved heart. The pain that was previously absent now made itself felt in every inch of my body. But this physical pain was insignificant compared to the turmoil in my heart and mind. As doctors and nurses moved around me, checking my vital signs and adjusting medications, I found myself lost in thought. The relief of being alive mingled with a profound sense of disorientation. The experience I had just had didn't fit into anything I had learned or believed throughout my life as a devout Muslim. I tried to cling to my beliefs, seeking comfort in the words of the Quran that I knew by heart. But each verse, each teaching, now seemed empty, devoid of the power and meaning they had always held for me. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a world of uncertainties where once there were only absolute truths. As the days passed and my body began to heal, the unrest in my heart only grew. I had survived an accident that should have killed me. But instead of gratitude and renewal of faith, I felt lost, adrift in a sea of doubts I never imagined existed. Looking out the hospital window at the world outside, a world that kept turning as if nothing had changed, I knew nothing would be the same. The accident had not only broken my body, it had fractured my faith, my understanding of the universe, and my place in it. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, I found myself on the brink of a journey I never planned to take. A journey of questioning, of searching, of rediscovery. A journey that would take me to places I never imagined, both inside and outside of myself. The end I had experienced on that dark road was, in fact, just the beginning. The beginning of what? I didn't yet know. But as night fell and stars began to dot the sky, I felt a mixture of fear and excitement for the unknown that awaited me. That night, for the first time in my adult life, I did not perform my nightly prayers. Instead, I lay awake, watching the shadows dance on the hospital ceiling, lost in thoughts about what I had experienced and what it meant for my future. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and populated by confused dreams of light and darkness, of certainty and doubt, of end and beginning. The days in the hospital dragged on, each bringing new challenges not only for my recovering body, but also for my restless mind. As the bruises faded and bones began to heal, the questions in my heart only multiplied. I began to question not just what I had experienced in that void between life and death, but the entire structure of beliefs that had sustained my existence until then. My faith, which had once been a bright beacon guiding every aspect of my life, now seemed like a flickering candle, threatened by winds of doubt I had never felt before. In an effort to find answers, I asked for my personal Quran to be brought to me. When the holy book finally reached my hands, I felt a mixture of familiar comfort and a new, strange apprehension. I opened the pages with reverence, as I always had, but this time, the words seemed different. Verses that once brought clarity now appeared opaque, full of hidden meanings I couldn't decipher. I read about Allah's mercy, about life after death, about divine judgment. But instead of finding comfort in these passages, I only found more questions. Why hadn't I felt this mercy during my experience? Where were the angels who were supposed to guide the souls of the faithful? And if what I experienced was indeed the afterlife, why was it so different from what the Quran described? As my recovery progressed, I received visits from Muslim friends and family. Their words of comfort, though well-intentioned, seemed hollow. They spoke about how my survival was a miracle, proof of Allah's mercy. It was a test of faith, they said, and you passed through it. But in my heart, I knew that wasn't how I felt. The test, if it was one, seemed to be just beginning. I tried to share my feelings with some closer friends, describing the darkness, the void, the absence of the divine presence I had so hoped for. Their reactions ranged from concern to outright denial. Some suggested I was confused due to medication or the trauma of the accident. Others gently warned against questioning Allah's ways. True faith, they reminded me, is in accepting even what we don't understand. But how could I simply accept? How could I ignore this experience that had shaken the very foundations of my belief? Finally, after weeks of recovery, I was discharged from the hospital. Coming home should have been a moment of joy and gratitude. Instead, I felt like a stranger in my own world. The daily routine that once brought me comfort, the prayers, the Quran readings, the visits to the mosque, now seemed mechanical and empty. On a Friday, I forced myself to go to the mosque for communal prayer, hoping that the familiarity of the ritual and the presence of other believers might rekindle my faith. The call to prayer sounded, its melody as beautiful and moving as ever. But as I knelt beside my Muslim brothers, I felt a deep disconnect. The words of the prayer, which I knew by heart, felt strange on my tongue. I looked around and saw serene faces, people lost in devotion, and there I was, an imposter among the faithful, my mind a whirlwind of doubts while my body performed the familiar movements of prayer. After the ceremony, I sought out the Imam, a wise man I had always admired for his deep understanding of Islam. I shared my concerns with him, hoping his wisdom could bring some clarity to my confusion. The Imam listened patiently, his face a mask of compassion and concern. "My son," he finally said, "faith is tested in many ways. Sometimes, Allah allows us to have doubts so that our faith can grow stronger. What you experienced was a trial, not an abandonment. Continue to pray, continue to seek guidance in the Quran, and Allah will illuminate your path." His words were kind, but they didn't bring the comfort I had hoped for. Instead of resolving my doubts, the conversation with the Imam only crystallized them. I realized I was seeking answers that perhaps my faith couldn't provide. In the weeks that followed, I found myself avoiding daily prayers. Each time the adhan sounded, calling the faithful to prayer, I felt a mixture of guilt and rebellion. Part of me longed for the simplicity and certainty of my old faith, but another part refused to ignore the questions that now dominated my thoughts. My wife, Amira, began to notice the change. She watched me with worried eyes, noting my hesitation before meals, where I once readily recited the Bismillah. She saw the religious books on my bedside table gathering dust. One night, she gently placed her hand on my shoulder and asked, "What's happening to you, my love? Where is the man I knew, so firm in his faith?" I wanted to explain, wanted to share the turmoil in my heart. But how could I make her understand something I didn't fully comprehend myself? How could I describe the emptiness I felt, the deafening silence where once there was certainty and purpose? "I'm finding myself," I replied hesitantly, knowing my words were inadequate to express the depth of my internal struggle. At night, lying in bed next to Amira, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying my near-death experience over and over. The darkness, the silence, the indefinable presence, it all seemed so real, so undeniable. And yet, it went against everything I had believed my entire life. The spirituality that once permeated every aspect of my existence now seemed like a distant memory. In its place was a sense of emptiness, a spiritual poverty I had never experienced before. It was as if I had lost an essential part of myself, leaving only a hole that nothing seemed to fill. I began to wonder, if I am no longer the devout Muslim I have always been, who am I? If my faith is no longer the foundation upon which I built my life, what remains? These questions haunted me day and night, eclipsing all other aspects of my life. My business, which I had previously conducted with the zeal of someone who believes they are fulfilling a divine duty, now seemed devoid of purpose. The decisions I once made with confidence, guided by Islamic principles, were now sources of anxiety and indecision. Friends and colleagues noticed the change. Where before I was known for my confidence and determination, they now saw me as hesitant, distracted. In business meetings, I found myself lost in thought, questioning not just my faith, but the very meaning of my existence. One afternoon, sitting in my office, looking out the window at the busy city below, I was struck by a devastating realization. Life went on. The world kept turning. People came and went. Everything followed its normal course. But for me, nothing was normal. I was stuck in a spiritual limbo, unable to return to the faith that had defined my life, but equally unable to move forward without it. It was in this moment of painful clarity that I made a decision. I couldn't continue living in this state of uncertainty and internal conflict. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened to me and what it meant for my future. If the answers couldn't be found within the familiar framework of my faith, then I would have to look for them elsewhere. With a mixture of apprehension and determination, I realized I was on the brink of a journey that would take me away from the safe, well-trodden path of my old faith, towards unknown and possibly dangerous territories. But it was a journey I needed to make, no matter the cost. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, I made a silent promise to myself. I would find answers to my questions, find a new meaning for my existence, even if it meant challenging everything I had always believed to be true. Dawn found me sitting in my home office, surrounded by books, and with my computer turned on. The night had been long and sleepless, but my mind was more alert than ever. Determined to find answers, I had plunged into a frantic search for information. I began to explore other spiritual sources, something I had never done before. My eyes scanned page after page of texts about near-death experiences from various cultures and religions. Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, atheists, all seemed to have their own stories to tell, their own interpretations of what happens when we are on the brink of death. The similarities between some accounts and my own experience were striking. Others spoke of tunnels of light, of encounters with deceased loved ones or divine beings, experiences I didn't have, but which fascinated me nonetheless. Each story I read opened up new possibilities, new questions. Among the many narratives, one in particular caught my attention. It was the account of a man, a former Christian minister, who had gone through a near-death experience during heart surgery. Like me, he saw no light and did not experience the divine presence he expected. His experience led him to question everything he believed, eventually abandoning his ministry and embarking on his own spiritual journey. His words echoed deeply within me. "True spirituality," he wrote, "is not in blindly accepting what we have been taught, but in having the courage to question, to seek, to explore the mysteries of the universe and our own existence." Inspired by this story and many others, I decided that I needed to go beyond mere reading. I needed to experience, to explore, to seek answers not just in books, but in the world around me and within myself. My first stop on this journey was a spiritual retreat in a small community in the mountains. It was an eclectic place, welcoming seekers from all backgrounds. Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and even atheists coexisted side by side, united by a common desire for understanding and enlightenment. I arrived there on a sunny spring afternoon, my light suitcase contrasting with the weight of expectations in my heart. The air was clean and fresh, laden with the aroma of pine trees and herbs. As I walked along the trail leading to the retreat center, I felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. The retreat leader, a middle-aged man with gentle eyes and a serene smile, welcomed me warmly. "Welcome," he said, "to a place where all questions are welcome and no answer is definitive." The days that followed were a roller coaster of emotions and experiences. I participated in guided meditation sessions, something I had never done before. At first, I found it difficult to calm my restless mind, but gradually, I began to feel a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. I engaged in deep discussions with other participants, each bringing their own unique perspective. A Buddhist monk spoke about the illusory nature of the self and the importance of compassion. A former Catholic nun shared her journey of leaving the convent to explore a broader spirituality. An atheist scientist offered a perspective based on quantum physics and neuroscience. Each conversation, each new idea, was like a piece of a complex puzzle. Sometimes, these pieces seemed to fit together, offering glimpses of a bigger picture. Other times, they seemed to contradict each other, leaving me more confused than before. One afternoon, I participated in a spiritual healing session. The practitioner, a gray-haired woman with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical, worked with energy around my body. As her hands moved, I felt waves of heat and cold, and for a moment, I experienced a sense of deep peace and connection with something greater than myself. For a brief instant, I thought I had found what I was looking for. The feeling of emptiness that had tormented me since the accident seemed to have been filled. But just as the experience came, it went, leaving me once again with questions. At night, sitting under a starry sky brighter than any I had ever seen in the city, I reflected on everything I had experienced. The stars above me seemed to twinkle with cosmic secrets, so close and yet so unreachable. I remembered the words of the Quran about the signs of Allah in the heavens and on earth. But now, looking at that glittering vastness, I wondered, what if the signs were there, but the interpretation I had always given them was wrong? On the last day of the retreat, I shared my story with the group. I spoke about the accident, about the darkness and emptiness I experienced, about how it had shaken my faith. I talked about my search for answers and how, even after all these experiences, I still felt lost. The silence that followed was profound, but not uncomfortable. Then, one by one, the others began to share. Some spoke of similar experiences. Others offered different perspectives. But in every word, in every look of understanding, I felt something I had lost long ago, a sense of connection, of community. When I left the retreat a week later, I didn't have all the answers I was seeking. In fact, it seemed I had even more questions, but something had changed within me. The emptiness that had tormented me before now seemed less like an abyss and more like a space of possibilities. I returned home with a new perspective, but also with a deeper understanding of the challenge I faced. My journey was far from over. In fact, I felt it was just beginning. Upon arriving home, I was greeted by Amira with a warm embrace, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked gently. I looked at her, the woman who had been by my side for so many years, through so many struggles and joys. How could I explain to her the storm of emotions and ideas that stirred my mind and heart? "Not exactly," I answered honestly. "But I think I'm starting to better understand the questions I need to ask." That night, lying in bed next to Amira, the questions came back with full force. What if what I saw during my near-death experience was the true nature of existence? What if there wasn't a merciful Allah waiting for us, but only a neutral and indifferent void? Or what if there was something more, something that went beyond all our religious conceptions? These questions tormented me night after night. During the day, I tried to resume my normal life, manage my business, interact with friends and family, but inside, I was in constant turmoil. I returned to the mosque, hoping to find some comfort in the familiarity of the rituals. But each prayer, each recitation of the Quran, now came accompanied by a chorus of doubts in my mind. The words that once brought peace now seemed empty, devoid of the power they once held over me. The Imam, noticing my agitation, called me for a private conversation after Friday prayers. Sitting in his office, he looked at me with a mixture of concern and compassion. "My son," he said, "I see that your struggle continues. Remember, faith is not the absence of doubts, but the courage to continue seeking despite them. His words were kind, but they didn't bring the comfort I was seeking. Instead, they only served to crystallize the distance I felt between myself and my old faith. But what if the search leads me away from Islam? I asked, giving voice to the fear that had been growing inside me. The Imam's face hardened slightly. Be careful, my son, he warned. There are many paths that can lead a person away from Allah, but only one that leads back to Him. Don't let yourself be seduced by false promises of enlightenment. I left the mosque that day with an even heavier weight in my heart. The Imam's words, though well-intentioned, only served to increase my sense of isolation. I realized that my journey would not be understood or accepted by many of those I respected most. In the days and weeks that followed, I continued my search. I read books on philosophy, science, and spirituality. I watched online lectures by thinkers from various traditions. I experimented with different forms of meditation and spiritual practices. Each new idea, each new experience, was like a piece of a giant and complex puzzle. Sometimes, I thought I was about to see the complete picture, only to realize there were even more pieces to fit. One night, as I sat in my office, surrounded by books and notes, Amira entered quietly. She looked at the pile of books, at the scattered notes, at the dark circles under my eyes, and sighed deeply. "You're losing yourself," she said softly. "This search, it's consuming you." I looked at her, seeing the love and concern in her eyes. I wanted to explain, wanted her to understand the importance of what I was doing. But how could I make her comprehend something that I didn't fully understand myself? "I need to do this, Amira," I replied, my voice laden with emotion. "I can't simply ignore what happened to me. I need to understand." Amira approached, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I know you're suffering, my love, but you don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." Her words touched something deep inside me. For the first time since the accident, I felt tears begin to flow. Amira enveloped me in her arms, and there we stood, in silence, as I finally allowed all the pain, confusion, and fear I had repressed to surface. In the days that followed, I realized I needed to find a balance. My search for answers was important, but I couldn't let it consume my entire life. I began to dedicate time to reconnecting with Amira, with my children, with the practical aspects of life I had neglected. However, the questions persisted, and with them came a growing sense of isolation from my Muslim community. Friends who used to seek me out for advice now seemed to avoid deep conversations with me. In business meetings, I could feel concerned glances and whispers when they thought I wasn't paying attention. It was during this period that I met Fatima, a psychologist who had gone through her own crisis of faith years before. Our meeting was by chance, or perhaps by fate, at a lecture on near-death experiences at the local university. Fatima listened to my story with an understanding I hadn't found anywhere else. She didn't offer easy answers or judgments, just compassionate listening and questions that made me think even more deeply. "What do you think this experience is trying to teach you?" she asked in one of our conversations. I reflected for a moment before answering. "Perhaps that reality is more complex than any religion or philosophy can fully capture, that there are mysteries in the universe that go beyond our current understanding." Fatima nodded thoughtfully. "And how does this understanding affect the way you live your life now?" This question caught me off guard. I realized that in all my search for answers, I had neglected to consider how these new perspectives could or should influence my daily actions, my interactions with others, my way of being in the world. It was a turning point. I began to realize that perhaps the answers I was seeking weren't in some sacred book or philosophical theory, but in how I chose to live my life in light of this new uncertainty. Gradually, I began to approach my search in a different way. Instead of looking for definitive answers, I began to embrace the questions themselves. I started to see my experience not as a curse that had destroyed my faith, but as a gift that had opened my eyes to the vastness and mystery of existence. This new perspective brought its own challenges. My relationship with the Muslim community became increasingly tense. The imam, who once saw me as an exemplary member of the congregation, now looked at me with a mixture of concern and disapproval. In a particularly tense conversation, he confronted me directly. "You are straying from the path of Allah," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "These ideas you're exploring, they're dangerous. They can lead you to perdition." I looked at the man I had respected for so long and felt a wave of sadness. "I respect your concern," I replied calmly, "but I can't ignore what I experienced. I can't pretend that I still have the same certainties I had before." The imam shook his head sadly. "I fear for your soul, my son. I hope you find your way back before it's too late." I left the mosque that day with a sense of finality. I realized that my journey had taken me beyond the limits of what my old community could accept or understand. This realization was painful, but also liberating. For the first time since the accident, I felt I was being truly honest with myself and others about my beliefs, or lack thereof. I shared these feelings with Amira, fearing her reaction. To my surprise and relief, she listened with compassion. "I don't fully understand what you're going through," she said, "but I love you and want to support you on this journey." Her support was a balm for my troubled soul. I realized that although my search was deeply personal, it didn't have to be solitary. As I distanced myself from the traditional Muslim community, I began to look for others who were on similar journeys. I found a diverse group of people, ex-religious, agnostics, spiritual seekers from various backgrounds, who met regularly to discuss issues of faith, philosophy, and the meaning of life. In these meetings, I found a new kind of community. One that didn't demand conformity of beliefs, but celebrated the diversity of perspectives and experiences. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could express my doubts and questions openly, without fear of judgment or rejection. One day, during one of these meetings, a woman shared her own near-death experience. Her story was surprisingly similar to mine. The same darkness, the same emptiness, the same absence of the divine presence she expected to find. "How did you deal with it?" I asked, feeling an immediate connection to her experience. She smiled softly. I realized that perhaps the void wasn't empty of meaning, but full of potential. Maybe the absence of a definitive answer is, in itself, an answer. One that invites us to embrace the mystery, to live with open questions instead of closed answers. Her words resonated deeply within me. I realized that perhaps my search wasn't for definitive answers, but for a way to live comfortably with uncertainty, to find meaning and purpose not despite the questions, but because of them. This understanding marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. A chapter not defined by religious certainties or rigid dogmas, but by an openness to the mystery of existence, a willingness to question and explore, and a commitment to live with compassion and integrity in the face of the unknown. As I embraced this new way of being, I felt a peace that had eluded me since the accident. It wasn't the peace of absolute certainty I knew before, but a deeper and more resilient peace, born from accepting the complexity and mystery of life. And so, my journey continued, no longer a desperate search for answers, but an ongoing exploration of the questions that make life rich and meaningful. A journey not to a fixed destination, but to a more expansive and compassionate way of being in the world.